Now I'd like to talk about the Iberian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. They were, after all, the very first Europeans who established colonial governments and societies in Southeast Asia. But before we go into why they were in Southeast Asia, it's important to understand what was Iberia before 1492, which was a significant date, as we all know. Iberia, as we know, the Iberian Peninsula is composed of Spain and Portugal. And before 1492, beginning from from the 700s, Berber Muslims from North Africa, who were called Moors, had conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula. Christian kingdoms to the north for several centuries planned and gradually retook control of the peninsula to retake the Iberian Peninsula. By 1300, Muslims controlled only Granada in the Al-Andalus region of southern Spain. So if you can see this map, you can see that this is prior to 1492, that this is actually the Iberian Peninsula, and it was called then Al-Andalus, which was part of the Moorish kingdom. The fate of the Iberian Peninsula changed with the marriage of two monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Who were they? So again, this is a map of the Iberian Peninsula from that period of the 13th to the 15th century. As you can see, that the Iberian Peninsula had the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon. And when I introduced to you Ferdinand and Isabella, Isabella was actually the queen of the Kingdom of Castile, while Ferdinand was the king of the Kingdom of Aragon. As you can see, at this point, Portugal was already finished their Reconquista, and I will explain that later. So the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand actually led to the union of these two kingdoms. But before that, let's talk a little bit about who these two monarchs were. Who was Isabella? Isabella was the queen of the Kingdom of Castile, which was an expansive kingdom that covered two-thirds of the Iberian Peninsula, but it was predominantly rural, a pastoral nomadic society shaped by constant warfare. According to Eliot, she was a woman of great character and determination, possesses her own mind, and accepted the marriage proposal with political sophistication. And who was Ferdinand? Ferdinand controlled the Kingdom of Aragon. It wasn't as big or densely populated as Castile, but it had its own strengths, particularly in the military, trade, and finance. As you can see, the Kingdom of Aragon is actually, which is now the area of Catalonia and Valencia, they were actually right on the coast. So you can see that this was a maritime or seaborne society. And because it was a maritime seaborne society, it had its own strengths. For example, it had to it was a pioneer in terms of external trading. They also needed to beef up their military because of attacks from outside. So even though Castile, as you can see, has a much larger area than Aragon, Aragon was still a very powerful kingdom at that point. Ferdinand himself was wily, resolute, and energetic, who proved adept at forwarding the interests of his wife then. A skillful negotiator and diplomat, and with Catalan, which is the present day area of where Barcelona is located, developed a commercial empire based on export of textiles, especially wool. Therefore, in contrast to the largely agricultural area and society and culture of Castile under Queen Isabella, in Catalan, it was more of an urban empire with a powerful urban bourgeoisie and very cosmopolitan in outlook. But their marriage proved to be very consequential in the sense that it wasn't just a marriage of two people, but of two royal houses. It was purely dynastic in order to strengthen the dynasties, their respective dynasties, and the Iberian Peninsula itself. It was a union of equals, each preserving their own institutions and own way of life. It was also a union of two lands with distinct histories and different stages of development. So, with their marriage in 1479, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile united their kingdoms, and 13 years later, their armies expelled the Muslims from Granada. So, upon marriage, they right away planned to develop what they call the Reconquista, or to plan this military campaign called the Reconquista. What does Reconquista mean? Reconquista in English means reconquest. It happened over a period of 750 years in which the Christian kingdoms expanded and reconquered the Moorish states of Al-Andalus and southern Spain. The Christian territories, with support from Rome, organized the retaking of Christian territories they believed that they had lost to Muslim invaders. But of course, for the Muslims, they have, since they were there for almost 800 years, they also believe that they were the rightful, um, they rightfully possessed these lands, right? In Portugal, the Reconquista ended earlier in 1249 with the conquest of the Algarve under King Alfonso III of Portugal. But the Reconquista was not really complete until 1492. It was a holy war against Islam too. There are many definitions to what Reconquista was, or it was just a struggle for land and power. It was seen as a crusade against the infidel, a succession of military expeditions, search for plunder, and popular migration. The, the motivation for the Reconquista is to finally kick out the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. And the two crowns were intensely devoted to the Reconquista, partly because they wanted Spain, this now united kingdom, to be much more powerful with the end of the Moorish presence in the Iberian Peninsula, but they were also very Catholic, and they subscribed to this Catholic orthodoxy, believing that the Catholic faith or Christianity should prevail over the Islamic faith. So the Iberian Peninsula and the Moros, so it started in the 11th century. When you think about, see this map, the Christians began the reconquest or the Reconquista. By the 13th century, the Muslim territories were then reduced to a few scattered kingdoms, which by 1492, the last Muslim-controlled area was in the south of Spain in the Andalusian region of Granada, was taken finally in 1492. This meant that the Spanish and the Portuguese always carried with them memories of their struggles against the Moros and the Muslims. So you see how the military campaign was conducted. So it started with the union of the Crown of Castile and Aragon, and then the Granada War, which meant that they sent enforcements or military enforcements and armies from their two kingdoms to attack Granada, which finally ended. When the war ended, that meant that the last Moorish king, King Boabdil, surrendered to the Catholic monarchs, which in 1492, and that was the last king of Granada, gives the keys of the city, which then, at this point in 1492, the end and the completion of the Reconquista. So 1492, as we all know, was also very significant in many ways, right? Because it also marked the beginning of the Spanish Empire with the conquest of the Americas. So the significance of the Reconquista was it was the unification of the Christian kingdoms, which brought more consolidation and power. It then began from their union, they began the forced conversion of the Muslims of Jews, and if they wanted to remain in Spain, the Muslims and Jews, then they would have to be forcibly converted to be Catholics. If not, they will be expelled. So the expulsion of the Muslims and the Jews, it also led to the strengthening of the Catholic Orthodoxy. And in order to make sure that the Catholic Orthodoxy was pure and complete, they also intensified the Spanish Inquisition. So Spain after 1492, after 1500, many clergy began to impose Christianity by coercion. The Muslims were given a choice between conversion or expulsion. By 1501, the kingdom became one of the Christian Muslims, or with the population called Moriscos. The crushing of Granada also invigorated the concept of a Christian Spain. Between 1485 and 1498, there was substantial migration where some 40,000 Christian Spaniards entered and settled in Granada. The Jews who stayed chose the alternative of conversion rather than expulsion, and they became known as conversos. Ferdinand himself was the Inquisitor General when they issued an edict of expulsion, which also intensified the Spanish Inquisition, which was actually began before 1492. But by July 31, 1492, they needed to accept baptism or leave the country. Thus, almost all of the Jews converted, hastened by the threat of the Inquisition. What was the Spanish Inquisition? It was founded in 1478 by the Catholic monarchs to maintain Catholic orthodoxy in their kingdoms and ensure converts follow the Catholic doctrine. It wasn't abolished until 1833. The death toll of the Spanish Inquisition was about 3,500 to 5,000 people, and it was also extended not only in the Iberian Peninsula but also in the Americas. How was this related to the Reconquista and Spain's development as an empire? This doctrine and practice actually shaped Spanish imperial ambitions. The struggle against Granada Muslims, the French, and the savages of other lands was simply a preparation for the great and prophetic imperial mission of liberating the Holy Land itself. They needed the Spanish Inquisition in order to protect the sanctity of the Catholic Orthodoxy. 1492, therefore, was also very significant because it led to the birth and rise of España as an empire. It led to the end of Moorish Spain, where Islam vanished from Castilian territory. It also led to the expansion of Muslims, which reinforced the vision of the king as the champion of Christendom, who would extend further the battle against Muslims and Jews, and eventually, with this purpose or this mission to liberate Jerusalem from its oppressors. This period gave Spaniards a pride in the emerging nation of España, or Spain, to which they belonged. So both the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal were at war with the Moorish kingdoms, as we already talked about, under the Reconquista, but in Portugal, the Reconquista ended earlier in 1249, while in Spain it only ended in 1492 with the unification of the kingdoms. But after the Reconquista, both kingdoms went into a program of overseas exploration and expansion. By the 15th century, they were known as the Spanish and Portuguese empires because of their realms' extensive overseas colonies, including Asia. So this you can see now, the Spanish Empire, which includes the Kingdom of Castile, Aragon, and Granada. And then you have the Kingdom of Portugal, which was also the base of the Portuguese Empire. What about Portugal in 1492? As I already explained, in Portugal, the Reconquista ended in 1249 with the conquest of the Algarve under King Alfonso III of Portugal. Like Spain, it was also a monarchy, part of the Iberian Peninsula and the predecessor of modern Portugal. The monarchy was in existence from 1139 until 1910. After 1248, with the Reconquista ending, it was known as the Kingdom of Portugal and the Algarves. And from the 15th century, it was known as the Portuguese Empire because of the realm's extensive overseas colonies. And in the 19th century, it was known as the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. So, what were the imperial impulses of Portugal then after it has completed its Reconquista? So the idea of conquest was also shaped by the Reconquista, which meant that they also saw their expansion as a war against Muslims and against Islam or Islamic expansion. They were united with Spain in their belief of the triumph of Christianity over the Moors and the infidels. In the 15th century, once they've completed the Reconquista, they also developed a program in order to advance to make all these pronounced advancements in cartography, shipbuilding, and navigational instruments. The Portuguese were actually more advanced than the Spanish since they came from seaborne cultures, unlike the agricultural Castilians. So remember, in terms of the map of Portugal, the Portugal also had all these expansive coasts, right? So it was also a maritime and seaborne society, which meant that they had developed a lot of advancements, especially in terms of navigation and shipping. What were their inventions and advancements? The caravel, for example, originated in Portugal in the mid 15th century as a development of the Portuguese fishing boat. This caravel would be very important and significant, especially as they then went outside of the Iberian Peninsula to conquer other lands. The caravel was also used by the Spanish and the Portuguese for long voyages. It was light, faster, and easier to maneuver. It sailed with the wind. It can carry hundreds of people and goods. Aside from the caravel, the Portuguese also were pioneers in other inventions in terms of navigation and shipping and instruments. So, what other instruments did they develop? The astrolabes, which was used to measure the angle between the horizon and celestial bodies, such as the sun, moon, or stars. These measurements help sailors determine the ship's latitude and longitude. Armillary spheres, which were models of the universe made up of rings that represented locations in the celestial sphere. Astronomers used them to describe the night sky and locations in the globe. And of course, the magnetic compass. The compass allowed explorers to maintain their course and chart their progress across the ocean even when they were out of sight of land. So other inventions and advancements, such as traverse board to keep track of a ship's speed and direction, and the backstaff that navigators use to measure altitude by looking at the shadow of the sun. In Portugal, there were also schools. They also founded schools and training programs for sailors, which developed sailing practices that helped the Portuguese position themselves and their newly discovered lands. On the field of military application, the construction of cannons and new types of swords, like the Carrack's black sword, also occurred, which really gave them a major advantage in terms of as a pioneer of exploration and eventually conquest. Advances in cartography and making. Aside from the caravels, they also developed bigger boats such as the carracks, which had three or four masts with square and triangular sails. Carracks were slower and less maneuverable than caravels, but they were sturdier in rough waters. Because they had much more storage space than caravels, Portuguese and Spanish crews used them for longer trips, especially to Asian ship spice markets. So the Portuguese were really the first, as I said, pioneer in terms of exploration. The Portuguese Empire was considered as the first colonial empire, spanning almost 6 centuries from the capture of Ceuta in Africa in 1415 to the handover of Macau in 1999 and the grant of sovereignty to East Timor in 2002. The empire spread throughout a vast number of territories that are now parts of 60 different sovereign states. During the Age of Discovery, in the 15th century, Portuguese sailors began exploring the coast of Africa and the Atlantic archipelagos in 1418 to 1419, using recent developments in navigation, cartography, and maritime technologies such as the caravel in order that they may find a sea route to the source of the lucrative spice trade in Asia. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India, and this will be very crucial as we think about how the Europeans finally made their way to Southeast Asia. In 1500, either by an accidental landfall or by the Crown's secret design, Pedro Alvarez Cabral discovered Brazil on the South American coast. So again, in terms of their motivations for conquest, so after all the internal developments within Iberian Peninsula itself, the Portuguese at that point, because they could not expand anymore within the Iberian Peninsula, thought about expansion outside the peninsula itself. Again, it was guided by the idea of Reconquista, the ultimate victory of Christianity over Islam. The Portugal's expansion was a continuation of their efforts to Christianize the rest. Their first explorers were mostly sailors, navigators, and mercenaries. They were always guided by the principles of exploration, discovery, and the pursuit of trade routes. And many of the famous Portuguese explorers are people that we are now familiar with, like Prince Henry the Navigator. He opened the first school of navigation. Bartholomew Diaz in 1488 becomes the first person to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southernmost tip of Africa. Vasco da Gama in 1498, he sailed around the tip of Africa up to the east coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean and on to India. He was the first European to reach India by sea, an important accomplishment that opened up a trade route, water route to India. This accomplishment also paved the way for Portugal to start building a colonial empire in Asia, including Southeast Asia. And as we said, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, credited with quote unquote discovering Brazil in 1500, he also made the first exploration of the northeast coast of South America. He claimed this land for Portugal. And Ferdinand Magellan, who actually sailed under the Spanish flag, but then also found its way to Southeast Asia. So Portugal leads the way when you think about the different explorations, right? So from Lisbon in Portugal, they went to find a route to Africa, and then from there, the Cape of Good Hope on to then India. So Prince Henry, then Bartolome Diaz, and I said Vasco da Gama. But of course, Spain would not really let Portugal to just do all the exploration and the conquest, right? And 1492 was very crucial for Spain because, as I said, that was also the time when Spain became united and kicked out the Moors and basically thought of itself as España, as an empire. And the first expedition that the Spanish monarchs funded was, of course, the famous expedition of Christopher Columbus. The Portuguese journeys inspired further journeys, especially Christopher Columbus, which was sent by the newly united states of Aragon and Castile. And as we all know, Christopher Columbus then landed in the Americas, and that really began the conquest of the Americas, which really marked the height of the Spanish Empire, as we all know that. Because of both the explorations of Spain and Portugal, it was very important for these two newish empires not to be in conflict with each other. So what happened was they signed the treaty in order to prevent conflicts, but also in order to mark the world in terms of places that each of them would discover. The Treaty of Tordesillas then was signed in 1494. It was endorsed by the Pope. It was intended to resolve the dispute that had been created following the return of Columbus and his crew, and the big questions of who would be the ones who would explore the Americas and who would go beyond the Americas, and how are we going to divide the Americas. So the treaty provided the answers to those conflicts, right? It divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe between Spain and Portugal along the meridian 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands along the coast of Africa. Spain gained lands including America, Brazil, also parts of it, but already belonged to, although portions of it belonged to Spain, was granted to Portugal because of the virtue that they were there first. So if you see this Treaty of Tordesillas, it was an agreement between the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. A line was drawn to divide the world. Lands to the west were controlled by Spain, so you can see most of the Americas, right? And then lands to the east were controlled by Portugal. So this part in Brazil was then divided, but then Portugal was able to maintain its control in Brazil. But then, as you can see, it wasn't really completely enforced, right? This treaty, because the treaty, in a way, um, was something that was supposed to be be implemented, but actually the question was who would implement this, right? So nobody implemented this. So in fact, this treaty or the lines or the division of the world was not strictly enforced. But what was so significant about this treaty itself is the fact that you now have this imperial outlook, the idea of these two kingdoms that they could explore, not just explore, but actually conquer the world, and that they're dividing the world amongst themselves, right? So it really led to this, it really encapsulates this whole idea of superiority, Western superiority. Okay, just to cap this discussion about the Iberian kingdoms again, just to conclude, in terms of the imperial impulses, the idea of conquest is also shaped by the Reconquista. Both the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal were united in their belief of the triumph of Christianity over the Moors and infidels. In the 15th century was also marked with pronounced advancements in cartography, shipbuilding, and navigational instruments. The Portuguese were more advanced than the Spanish because they came from seaborne cultures, and that's why they were actually the very first ones who then conquered or established their territories first in Africa, then India, and eventually in Southeast Asia. So Spain was a bigger and richer kingdom, especially with the unification of Castile and Aragon. And really, after 1492, the kingdom of Spain was very determined in order to also carry out or undertake a program of first exploration and then eventually conquest and colonialism. So next, for our next lecture, we are going to talk about how did these kingdoms then arrive in Southeast Asia.